Thanks for tuning in. I'm Peter Wainwright, host of Radio Sidney's show, Peninsula Affairs, and a former 7-term councillor for the town of Sidney. In November 2023, the province passed legislation that brought about sweeping changes to the local government planning processes and increased density in areas currently zoned for single-family use and in areas near transit hubs. I'll explain these legislation changes in this presentation and how they affect the Saanich Peninsula. There were 3 pieces of housing legislation adopted in November 2023. Bill 44 is about residential development, and it's the one that made the changes to the single-family zoning and to the planning processes. Bill 46 is about development financing. It made changes to development cost charges and community amenity contributions. And lastly, there's Bill 47, transit-oriented areas. And this is the one you've heard about on the news, where you can erect a 10-story building within 200 meters of a major transit stop. So, let's start by talking about Bill 44, which has 2 parts: the changes to single-family zoning and the changes to development process. So we'll start with the changes to the single-family zone. The first change they announced is essentially province-wide. It allows secondary suites or accessory dwelling units in any single-family zone, regardless of urban containment boundary or municipality size. Now, there are some important exemptions to that. You can only do a secondary suite unless you're on municipally operated sewer or have a lot greater than a hectare. It also does not apply to local trust areas under the Island Trust Act, so it does not apply throughout the Gulf Islands. It also doesn't apply in an area covered by a rural land use bylaw per section 457 of the Local Government Act, but that shouldn't matter on the peninsula. So that's the secondary suite or accessory dwelling unit part. And this applies everywhere on the peninsula where there's a single family zone, but it might only allow you to do a secondary suite. The second change, and this is the part that got a lot of media attention, allows you to have up to 3, 4, or 6 units on a single family lot with some conditions. Now, it's important to note this only applies in municipalities with a population of more than 5,000 and only within the urban containment boundary. So North Saanich is entirely outside the urban containment boundary. Therefore, none of what I'm about to describe applies to North Saanich. It does, however, apply to all of Sidney and some of Central Saanich, and it'll be in effect starting July 1st. If you have a lot 280 square meters or less in size in a municipality over 5,000 inside the urban containment boundary, you're allowed to do up to 3 units. If your lot is more than 280 square meters, again, municipality over 5,000 and inside the urban containment boundary, you're allowed up to 4 units. And then finally, the part that people are concerned about, you're allowed up to 6 units on a lot bigger than 280 square meters, again, municipality over 5,000 and inside the urban containment boundary, if you're within 400 meters of a bus stop with frequent service every 15 minutes. However, since we don't have bus routes with stops every 15 minutes on the peninsula, the ability for up to 6 units doesn't apply anywhere on the peninsula, at least not yet. So the big question, how big is 280 square meters? And lots, of course, can be different dimensions, but 280 square meters is 20 meters by 14 meters, for example, which is about 66 feet by 46 feet. That's pretty small. Most people who own a single-family detached house, their lot size is going to be bigger than 280 square meters, which is only about 1/14 of an acre. So when this comes into effect, if you're not in a development permit area and you don't need a variance, You'll just need to apply for a building permit. That's it. Okay, there is some fine print, and here we go. So, you can't do this if you're not on municipal water and sewer, and it has to be operated by a regional district or municipality. It's not good enough if a private developer built it and is operating the treatment plant. The legislation also does not apply if you have a lot bigger than an acre, and it may not apply if you've got a heritage designation or a heritage agreement or hazardous conditions such as floodplains. The legislation may not apply. If you're in an environmentally sensitive area, like the Roberts Bay ESA, or a development permit area for the protection of natural environment, riparian area, or something similar, you may be exempt. However, the municipality can't use this to unreasonably obstruct the intent of Bill 44. So what this means, if you're in the Roberts Bay ESA, or the Beaufort Road ESA, or some other designated ESA, you still need to apply for a development permit, and you'd have to go through that process. If land is within the ALR requirements still apply. Bill 44 does not remove that. And as a final point, which could be significant, if you've got covenants, easements, or other kinds of charges registered on title, they're still there. Bill 44 does not remove those. And in days gone by, municipalities would sometimes register plans on title if they were concerned about a developer or future property owner changing things later. So that's the full picture on the 3, 4, or 6 units on single-family zones. About 80% of the single-family zone lots in Sydney are more than 280 square meters and would be able to do 4 units. And none of the exemptions I mentioned above are likely to apply in Sydney. So if you're in a small lot in Sydney, the less than 280 square meters, most of those are intensive development permit areas for form and character, and you would still need to apply for a development permit unless that changes at some time in future. And I'll note that none of this applies if you're in North Saanich. In Central Saanich, you should ask the district how it applies to your lot, but they have areas that are in the urban containment boundary. There won't be any 6-unit developments. It'll be a mix of 3 and 4, just like in Sydney's case. Okay, now let's move on to the process changes, which are significant. Some of them have already started. I'm not going to list all the changes in detail, but starting with the big one, there will be no more public hearings for residential developments consistent with the OCP. And we're already seeing that happen. And you can go from first reading to final adoption on the same night for something like that, as recently happened in Sydney. The next big process change is that all the municipalities are being required to update their zoning bylaws to implement the Bill 44 single-family zoning changes. And that's by June 30th, because those changes come into effect on July 1st. Then there's a requirement for the municipalities to update their housing needs report, or H&R, using a provincial methodology that hasn't been released yet, but is expected to be released soon. And Bill 44 requires those housing needs reports to be updated on a regular basis. So the housing needs report must be completed by January 1st of 2025. So that's less than a year away now. And after that, the municipalities must update their OCP to provide the 20-year housing supply forecast by that new housing needs report. And they must get that OCP update completed by December 31st, 2025. Now that applies to everybody, including North Saanich. And then the last bit, the zoning bylaws must be updated to pre-zone the land to match what's in the OCP. And that also has to be completed by December 31st, 2025. So that's some significant processes and work that has to be completed by the end of 2025, which is not that far away. And each municipality will be approaching this a bit differently because Bill 44 applies a bit differently to each of them. Okay, now we'll move on to Bill 46, the development financing one. For those of you who may not be aware, development cost charges, or DCCs, are a tool local governments can use to fund community infrastructure. The idea is that growth pays for the infrastructure required to service that growth rather than the current taxpayers. DCCs are generally considered a good thing, and most municipalities have them. But the process to adopt a DCC is pretty lengthy. Bill 46 expands the scope of the kinds of infrastructure that can be funded by DCCs, and it also makes changes to community amenity contributions. And while amenity contributions are useful, negotiating amenity contributions during the development approval process generally slows things down quite a bit and causes a lot of uncertainty for the developer. And that's something the province wanted to eliminate. So instead, Bill 46 is requiring that municipalities figure out their amenity costs up front and put them in an amenity cost charge bylaw to fund specific amenities. Bill 46 also expands the list of amenities that can be funded this way. But to access or use these new tools, municipalities have got some process to go through to implement them. And there are also some new restrictions that have been introduced. For example, you can't use amenity contributions to fund affordable housing. So municipalities are going to have to review their policies and their bylaws and may need to make some adjustments because of these changes. But the timing of adopting new DCCs and adopting these amenity cost charge bylaws is at the discretion of the municipality. There's no specific deadline for that. Okay, on to the third bill, the Transit-Oriented Areas, Bill 47. So the province has designated transit-oriented areas, or TOAs, based on distance from major transit facilities as prescribed in the regulations. And basically this means they've made a list of TOAs. So let's have a closer look at that list. So there are 4 tiers. At the top are SkyTrain stations and anything within 800 meters of them. And the next tiers down are bus exchanges and West Coast Express stations and everything within 400 meters. And the bottom tier are designated bus stops with frequent service. And 2 orders in council came out designating a list of 52 transit-oriented areas. So cutting to the chase, there are no Tier 4 frequent bus stops prescribed in the regulations yet. And there are no TOAs designated on the Saanich Peninsula or the Gulf Islands. The nearest one is the Uptown Exchange in Saanich. So Bill 47 doesn't apply to the peninsula, at least not yet. But let's have a look at the details of what it requires. Within these transit-oriented areas, local governments must rezone by June 30th to allow the density, size, and dimensions specified in the regulations. They must also remove the parking restrictions for off-street residential parking, except for disabled spaces. And in doing that, they have to consider the guidance and details in the provincial policy manual. Another detail of this is that if a parcel is even slightly within that radius, it's in. In other words, the whole parcel is in, even if 99% of the parcel is outside that radius. Now, there are also some exemptions. If the land is zoned industrial or for agricultural use, it's exempt. And things like floodplain, agricultural land reserve, hazard areas, ESAs, and heritage designations also influence it. So, let's look at the details of these 4 tiers, starting with SkyTrain at the top, and at the bottom, the frequent service bus stops. So if you're within 200 meters of a SkyTrain station, you're allowed to build up to 20 stories with a floor area ratio, or FAR, of 5.0. At the bottom, bus stops, which I've noted have not been designated yet, but likely eventually will be. If you're within 200 meters of one of these bus stops with frequent service, yet to be designated, you can do up to 6 stories and an FAR of 2.5. So it's a range from allowing from 4 stories up to 4 stories to up to 20 stories, depending on the magnitude of the transit station and how close you are. Okay, so here's what the Uptown Exchange looks like and those 200 and 400 meter radius. You can see that there are parcels around the fringe of that 400 meter radius that are mostly outside the radius, but the entire parcel is going to get pulled in. Okay, so I've talked about the 3 bills separately. Let's have a look at the timeline when you put it all together. And as you can see, it's pretty concerning. So starting at the top with things that are now in effect, process changes like public hearings no longer being allowed, development financing changes are in effect, although councils may need to update DCCs and amenity cost bylaws before they can do any of that. But there are some changes that kicked in with that. For example, you can't use amenity contributions for affordable housing anymore. And the transit-oriented areas, which have been designated, those changes are in effect now. I've put on the list that the province is releasing $51 million to the local governments to help them implement all these changes. And that's a little over $200,000 for each of the Peninsula municipalities. Helpful, but not enough to cover the full cost that they're going to have to deal with. Okay. An important one, the Housing Needs Report methodology, scheduled to be released in early 2024. That has a profound effect on when the local governments can get going on that work. Because without the methodology, they really can't do anything. Also on the list here, this is that discretionary item, reviewing the amenity contribution policies, etc. No particular deadline, but probably fits in some of the stuff with other changes they're doing to zoning and whatever. The province has also said that they're going to provide guidance to the municipalities on updating their OCPs and zoning bylaws, and that guidance will be provided in June, July, which hopefully isn't going to affect the work the municipalities are doing to meet that June 30th zoning bylaw deadline. So, as I said, there is that zoning bylaw amendment or requirement, including They must implement all the single-family changes and any transit-oriented areas changes. Then those single-family changes actually come into effect on July 1st, the next day. And next on the last couple of items on the list, the local governments must have completed their housing needs reports using that provincial methodology by January 1st, 2025. That's next year. And then when they've got that done, they have to update their OCP to provide the 20-year housing supply forecast in that housing needs report, and also update their zoning bylaw to pre-zone to match that new OCP. And all of that has to be done by December 31st. So that's some significant work that has to be accomplished within a relatively short timeline. Okay, so that completes the overview of the legislation and how it applies. This slide is the references for the legislation and policies that I've mentioned. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write info@radiosidney.ca. And thanks for watching.